first time ever.
Hear you loud and clearly.
And it was going places.
That stuff's great.
But the game is not a roguelike.
Boomer shooter.
Bang.
Hello, this is John St. John, and you're listening to KEEP in the Keep, bringing you all the hits from the finest in the world of gaming and entertainment. Now sit back and relax as the drowned god Cthulhu lulls your mind with the tastiest talk in town.
Welcome to another chapter of In the Keep podcast. I'm your very own prophet of the drowned god, the Motherlode. The Keep is a collective of gaming enthusiasts compelled by the drowned god Cthulhu to frag and jib one another into oblivion for all eternity.
My name is Rich Vreeland. I've been making music and doing other music and sound related things for the last 15 years under the name Disasterpeace. From New York City originally. Live in Los Angeles. Done a lot of work in games. Done a couple of film scores. I've done some software. Done some cartoons. Done a little bit of everything. So it's kind of been my jam. It's kind of like being a novelty seeker, basically. Seeking out different kinds of things.
I mean,
so, yeah.
Right up front, dude, I've been a fan of yours since for as long as I can really remember, at least since I was in high school. And
cool.
The first game that I played of yours was Fez. And I still, when I'm studying or just trying to chill out, I still put on that soundtrack all the time. And it's just kind of, I don't know, kind of embedded in my heart a little bit. I just love that soundtrack. I love that game, period. And
cool.
And then, I didn't really think too much of it. At that time, I wasn't so into who made things, and I didn't really know too much about, who you were, what you were doing. And then a couple of years later, It Follows comes out, and I was just who did the fucking soundtrack to this? And then I realized there was this connection between all these things that I liked. And then it was Hyper Light Drifter after that, and then so on and so forth. And
It's really a brain moment.
yeah, there's a link somewhere in here, but I guess the way to kind of get into this is what made you really want to start into music. I've read all the shit online. I think your dad was your church music director, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, my stepfather growing up. So yeah, I mean, since I was young, I was always into creating stuff, and initially it was mostly visual art kind of stuff. I used to. When I go to a relative's house, the first thing I do is go to the computer and start messing around. And so I have a lot of fond memories of stupid stuff, loading up Microsoft Word templates for various business activities and putting my own name into it and coming up with logos and the Vreeland Corporation or something. And I was 6 years old. Yeah. So that was kind of where it started for me. And I think a little bit of that was definitely. Well, a lot of it was influenced by my parents, specifically my mom and my stepfather, who I lived with. My mom was a graphic designer for a long time and worked at a printing press, and my stepfather was very creative. Did lots of different things: photography, write poetry, music. So I kind of just I saw that and kind of picked up the bug. And I didn't really get into music until earnestly. I didn't really get into it until later. There was a lot of music going on in my family. My stepfather was music director at the church that we went to. My mom was involved with that. My sister was always singing and coming up with stuff since she was very little. So, there wasn't a lot of maybe sonic real estate in my household growing up. So I spent a lot of my time just kind of locked up in my room, making stuff. And I didn't really get into music until actually playing it so much until I was a teenager, until I was in high school and I started playing guitar. So that's kind of the early years.
So what was the moment when you decided I need to go pick up that guitar and start playing?
Well, it's kind of like graduated over time because I think I got like a toy guitar at one point, maybe when I was like 10 or 11 years old. One of those guitars that has like a built-in amplifier and it has like built-in distortion and stuff. It was a right-handed guitar, and I'm kind of I'm not really I don't know I don't I think people are ambidextrous, can do things with the same thing with both hands. I can't really, but I do a lot of things with my left hand. And playing guitar was not comfortable. I used to play it like a lap steel guitar as like a 10-year-old. It's just, and I would just like play. I would just kind of just play. I think I would just play like open chords or something. And I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. And that didn't really go anywhere, though. I mean, I didn't really do anything with that. I got into this thing online called e-wrestling in like the late 90s, early 2000s, which was like competitive fan fiction wrestling. You come up with your own character.
Right up my alley.
It was super fun. It was super fun and very, very macho activity. In at least, in theory, lots of like trash talking but lots of like making artwork for other people. I kind of like started a little. It was like a little like hustle basically as a teenager where I was making logos and websites for other kids, entrance music. And so I kind of started messing with like audio software just to do like, take a song I like, maybe it has like a riff or something, like an intro, and I just like loop that part. And I started to develop like, just I guess some of the skills that you would need to be a freelancer, because I was basically freelancing, even though it was, not really a professional environment or whatever. But a lot of those things kind of carried over, either indirectly in the sense that like, I was developing kind of this freelance experience of doing work for people and being creative and that kind of thing, getting paid, but or more directly in the sense that like I actually got my first video game project directly from being involved with e-wrestling. So it was like a really strange kind of trajectory that I took to get into music, writing music for stuff. Really, really weird.
So like that required you to compose entrance music, I guess, for other people and everything.
Well, no. So I didn't actually, I didn't actually write music for wrestling stuff ever, really. But what happened was, someone who worked at a mobile game company, I guess, posted like a wanted ad on a message board looking for music for some like really old school, like pre-smartphone era, like cell phone games. And someone who ran in the same circles kind of, connected me to it. I must have been like 18 or 19. And I had basically stopped participating in e-wrestling at that point. But I still kind of like, I hovered around a little bit and I would like post music there. And he was like, oh, you should, here, check this out. There's people looking for music. They're looking for MIDI files, which is like literally what I was doing at that time, because I didn't really have any production chops. Like I had just kind of started messing with the computer and doing music. So I found a piece of software that let me do guitar tablature. Mm-hmm. And it had like MIDI. So I could like write down my guitar parts that I came up with, but then I could also like flush them out with other instruments. And then you could save it as a MIDI file. So that's pretty much everything that I was doing at that time. And so it was like a kind of a serendipitous opportunity. And I reached out to them and I like sent them a bunch of MIDI files. And then maybe like 5 months later or something crazy, they're like, yeah, let's work on some stuff. And so I got to work on a couple of games just doing MIDI files. So I was doing like music. I did music for like a licensed game show game for like really crappy cell phone, like the game Press Your Luck, which is like it's where that very meme, I think, or maybe not. I thought maybe the I think that might be from that might be from Price is Right, but
I'm pretty sure that I was going to say, like, I'm pretty sure that's the Price is Right, man.
Yeah. But I got to work on that. So I did some like covers of like Press Your Luck game show music. And then I did I did a bunch of stuff for a zombie game that never got made. They had me do a bunch of like sound effects using like MIDI files, which is really weird, but that's kind of where I guess the technology was at that time. So, basically I got to do a bunch of stuff. There was basically no oversight. I got paid. They didn't really use any of the things I did. Like one of the games they even shipped without any music at all. So I don't really know why. Like it didn't really work out, but I got paid, and I was like, oh, I guess this is like a possibility for me. So that's actually one of my albums, Limeade Grin. It's just a collection of like souped up MIDI files that I wrote for like a puzzle game called Wasabi that got released without any music, like right at the end of the pre-smartphone era age. So that's kind of where I started with doing soundtracks and stuff. But I was already writing music at that point, like just for fun.
So let's actually like back the horse up across the creek again. How did you end up as an enthusiast of e-wrestling in the first place? Like, how does one go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, wrestling was really popular when I was in high school and middle
like
school.
Like the late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
the
Stone
Attitude,
Cold Steve Austin,
the Attitude Era, yeah, basically like the golden era of professional wrestling. But my dad had wrestling pay-per-view tapes on VHS, and I used to watch them a lot. He had like 88 SummerSlam 88 and like Royal Rumble 89, like stuff like that. So it was like Bret Hart, and it was like early Undertaker, like early 90s, and Hulk Hogan, Shawn Michaels, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I always liked it. So, and then when I was a teenager, I got really into it because it was something that I could share with my friends. It was like a culturally acceptable form of soap opera for like teenage boys. And I don't know. There's actually a lot of like, there's a lot of depth to it and a lot of like human psychology in it that was really interesting. I think just looking back at it now.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know this, but I grew up in Alabama, and wrestling is huge there. Still is like much bigger in the Southeast than it is in most places in North America, I would say.
Sure, yeah.
And I like when I got out of high school, went straight into like I wanted to be a wrestler and trained to do it, and did it for a couple of years before I decided like probably not a great way to make money.
Oh wow, cool. Interesting.
But yeah, a long time. Like my middle name is Kane, and I was convinced that my mom named me after Kane, even though it's spelled completely different and everything. Like,
that would be a weird thing to be named after.
Yeah, but I actually interviewed Mike Herman, who did Retromania Wrestling. It's his game that's out right now, and to get to talk a lot about just kind of the psychology and everything of wrestling in that podcast. But I agree with you. It's like, even though it's so stupid and so silly and everything, it is truly like just the best window into the zeitgeist of what people are thinking at the time. And
yeah,
especially during the 90s, that was a very special era, I should say. In the
the whole story of that whole era is really fascinating, just with the WCW and how things were a certain way for a long time. And then everybody started getting into this, like, basically this, like, this war of who can be more like over the top and like violent, like pushing the envelope.
Yeah, there's a great Vice documentary about Brian Pillman that came out like last week or whatever, and I watched it. But it's like the point where he just starts exposing the business live on TV, and then he pulls out a gun and all that. He was just crazy maniac, essentially. I mean, in character. But yeah, it totally changed the industry. Like people like him at that and the Montreal Screwjob were like the nails in the coffin of kayfabe.
Yeah,
and yeah, are you following AEW these days, or
just a little bit? Like I haven't been watching it like like every week or whatever, but every once in a while I'll pop in and see what's going on. So
you got to check out this Blood and Guts match they had a few weeks ago. Is essentially it is a War Games match, and it's like Chris Jericho's team versus Maxwell Jacob Freeman's team. Epic, like really, really great. Like if you harken back to that crazy, violent, super over the top wrestling from that era, I think that they're really trying to pursue that and get back to that.
I think what I liked, I mean, I think I gravitated more to the storylines and the sort of like just the kind of psychological warfare from like the wrestling standpoint. I always really liked the technical wrestling.
Me too. That's
Yeah,
the kind of wrestler I wanted to be, was like Benoit.
Always liked Bret Hart and the wrestling of Benoit and people like that. Yeah.
So you were such a fan of this that you decided, like, hell, I'm just going to go on the net, and you found this place where you could write your own stories, which is kind of what you're saying about, you were interested in the psychology of it.
Yeah, I think so. This is my guess on how I got into this. Some friends in school were doing fantasy basketball, and fantasy. This was like fantasy football, like all that stuff was like starting to, I guess, pick up, like late '90s, because I was still pretty young when I was doing that. I think I was in middle school, and I must have just like searched for fantasy wrestling or something and be like, oh, this is actually a thing, and yeah, that's kind of how. And then I just kind of like got into it.
Do you think that maybe you have an ability to kind of like tap in and understand emotion? Because in your music, at least, you're really good. And you talked about this in one of the, I don't remember what panel it was. I watched a video where you talked on a panel one time, and you mentioned like how, we're really into creating emotion and everything, which is what music essentially to me is. But
Yeah.
do you think that you have an ability to kind of tap into that's not common?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I would say that that's kind of my, that's like the thing that I'm really good at, is just identifying emotions. Like I think I have a pretty good sense of people, and I kind of find myself like falling into like psychologist mode sometimes with people, because I'm very, I don't know, I just feel like I can kind of pick up on what people are putting out there. And I've never been never been a great storyteller or anything like that, but I find that I can kind of like, there's something about like emotions that I can kind of channel. And like, actually for me, like the most effective and like cathartic way for me to actually like to like process emotions is playing the piano. Like I just sit down and start playing, like I'll play in like C major and just like, I'll just figure it out. Like it'll just like come out of me. So, and that's not always the case when I make music. I mean, sometimes it can be very, it could be a little bit more intellectual or whatever, but as just a sort of like a base process for me, it's, I have a very, I guess, very tightly like connected kind of relationship to it, as far as how I like the way that I'm able to kind of channel things to some degree.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like, there's almost an empath quality to it, in that with music especially, but in, really any art, the idea is to create an emotion in someone. And if you hit the nail on the head, which for most of your catalog, I think I've listened to all of it at this point.
That's
really
an achievement.
do.
That's a lot.
but like, if someone comes to you, like a potential, collaborator, and they say like, I really want to capture this kind of emotion, or like get to this, like, and they probably, they're not a musician most of the time. So they're just going to say like, this is what I kind of want. And you have to, as the musician, figure out what that means to them, and then create it, make it into what they want it to be. And yeah, there's got to be something to that. You can't quantify genius, but
well, I think that actually that process is not always so empathetic, because it tends to, in my experience, the disagreements tend to come from matters of taste, and matters of taste don't really have much to do with like how someone's feeling. You know what I mean? So it's like a different skill, I think, than kind of the skill that I feel like is one of the things that just intuitively, like I have a kind of like a affinity for, which is being able to like understand people like emotionally. So I think that's to say that it maybe, I don't know how much of a benefit it has in like actually figuring people out, but maybe it definitely like helps me in the sense that people can hear that in my music and that they gravitate towards it, and so it makes it a little easier to find people to work with.
I mean, everyone's a critic, man.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
You very clearly have successfully, at least to a good chunk of people that have heard your stuff, they hear it and the intended reaction happens. Like, this song should make you feel a little bit hesitant to go around that corner in the game or whatever. And if you successfully invoke that emotion, then I guess it works, regardless of what their taste is.
Yeah, it's also interesting because, even if you are like hyper tuned into that kind of thing, you are dealing in kind of like a cultural cachet. It's kind of like, what is the, like, what are the cultural like landmarks for different kinds of sounds? Like, like how are you going to reach the widest audience or whatever? Like you're kind of dealing in like cultural language, like when you're writing music. And depending, I guess that's not always going to line up with, so I think that's why like working in genres has been like kind of it's been good for me. It's nice to have, sometimes it's nice to have like a template that you can follow and you're like, okay, here's the language that's kind of been established and I can kind of work within that framework and kind of try to bring my own perspective to this while still honoring the language that exists, like whether it's, for like horror, film noir or whatever.
It's interesting how kind of what you're going at there when you talk about the different cultural aspects of it.
Yeah.
So for instance, like red, the color red can invoke a completely different emotion in different people based on what their culture is. Like in our kind of culture, it could mean like blood, it could mean love or whatever. It could mean something totally different in like East Asia. But I don't see any situation where you play the key of D minor and it doesn't have that kind of like heart stopping, like, oh, this is like a somber thing. And I feel like that might be, I don't know if it's evolutionarily older or just more cross-cultural or what, but
yeah. I mean, here's my take on that. So I think, based on what I know and what I've read and what I've seen other people talk about with keys and keys being associated with different emotions, there seems to be a lot of disagreement about that. Like people have different, there's some that are like fairly, I think the reason that some are fairly common, like the consensus, there's like almost there's a pretty, like a lot of people agree that like C major is like, has sort of like a simple, like plain kind of feeling to it. And I think a lot of it actually just has to do with our, our experiences auditorily, like what we've heard and how, what we associate, because a lot of times, like most people don't have perfect pitch, but, I think subconsciously, if you listen to a lot of music and you hear a chord, you just hear, D minor or whatever, that might evoke not just the chord, not just the key, but also the instrument that it's played on, that might evoke like a certain, memory of a certain song because the link between music and memory is so strong. So I kind of gravitate towards that idea. I definitely like, there was like I was visiting a friend and they had an article on their fridge that was just like a list of like emotional descriptors for all the different keys. And I kind of like, I took a picture of it and I went home and I like tried to come up with my own. And then I like compared them and it was like maybe half of them were similar and then half were like totally different. And then I even tried to play in the style, like with the adjectives in mind that they had thought of, like, I don't know, C sharp minor is jubilant or something. That's a terrible example, but I would try to like, evoke that and I couldn't do it. So I think, yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting kind of thought experiment, but I feel like it's very personal. I think too.
You have to do some kind of weird BF Skinner experiment where you take a baby and you just like play really somber, sad music and teach them that means happy. Like you're like, oh, look, it's a clown, but with like Beethoven's Fifth playing or something.
Yeah.
Something that's supposed to invoke something bad. And then and they'll go the rest of their life thinking that's happy music. And then, I don't know, you play like,
you'd have to isolate them basically from like everything else, because I mean, I really do think that there is a certain I mean, there is certainly a tradition, a musical tradition, and there's a certain rationality to it as far as like, the role of fifths and fourths and thirds and all this kind of stuff. But there have been other cultures at different times that have different kind of sensibilities about different intervals. So it's obviously not, there's some level of arbitrariness, I think, to it.
To get back to like, talking about the nostalgia factor and the fact that you kind of have these tropes that are almost programmed into us through the media that we've consumed throughout our lives and everything. Like for a great example would be like in It Follows, you very clearly have like a reference to Psycho soundtrack in that music. But when people hear that, like, da, 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 they immediately think serial killer chasing me. Like there's no getting around that programming.
Yeah.
Even if they've never seen Psycho, it's just like so pervasive in the world at this point. You can't get away from it.
Yeah. And that's why it was a touchstone for me because, I didn't have much of a background in horror as a genre, like the genre, as far as certainly not writing, like a couple of cues here and there for different projects. I had to do something scary, but for the most part, not really like in that direct line, and definitely not a student of horror films by any stretch of the imagination. Like partially just because I've never really liked watching things that are kind of really dark and don't have any silver lining. So
sounds like you had a happy childhood, man.
I think it was pretty okay. I think part of it was just that it would not sit well with me. Like I remember I saw Jurassic Park when I was like maybe 6 or 7 years old, and I had nightmares about dinosaurs. So, I wasn't like a very tough kid when it came to that kind of stuff. Like I didn't want to go.
The Undertaker was cool.
Yeah. That was not scary. That's different. But like the Snow White ride at Disneyland, like, no, I'm good. Dark places, witches, like, not too much for me. So I kind of kept me away from it for a long time. I was always more into like, I don't know, like emo kind of stuff, like happy emo stuff. Like I got really into Ghibli, and when I was like starting college, like I was obsessed with like Amelie and shit like that. So that was kind of my headspace. So everything I knew about horror was basically just cultural touchstones that most people would know, like pop culture. And the Psycho theme to me is like it's hit that level of pop culture where people just know it because it's basically like a meme, because it's just so ingrained. So I'm not even sure that I was intentionally trying to do that. I mean, I think I remember when I was making the first track for It Follows, and it has that theme in it. I was thinking about it. The sound actually reminded me of this alarm clock that I had, like one of those LED like Radio Shack alarm clocks from like the 90s. I don't know if you remember them. They had this horrible sound. That's
what my phone makes that noise when I wake up.
Does it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom had one when I was a kid, and that's like, wake the fuck up.
The little white cube. You know what I'm talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what it reminded me of. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. I used to have dreams about that because I'd still be sleeping and like in REM or whatever. And I'd be hearing my alarm going off, and I'd be like, I can't. Trying to like find where the alarm clock is, and I can't find it in my dream, and I'm like unplugging stuff, and I'm like slowly going crazy until I wake up.
But that pattern means urgency, move. Like,
yes,
now's
exactly.
the time. Yeah. Get
so
out of your comfort zone.
So it makes sense that there's some kind of connection there between that and the Psycho theme and the dissonance of it. It's just so dissonant.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you were seeing kind of scenes from the film and everything as you were working on that, and you had an idea of like, okay, for this scene I need to invoke kind of this thing. So what were some of the other, there's not just like straight up horror, but the other things that you were trying to capture, in that film in particular?
So yeah, there's definitely a duality to that score. I mean, there's kind of the straight up, just like go crazy, make it scary. And I was also experimenting with mimicking some of the cues. Like there was a bunch of aleatoric stuff in there from Krzysztof Penderecki. And I was trying to like come up with aleatoric processes for synthesizers. So like things like having, like a bunch of pitches, and then they like slowly, diverge and get really dissonant, and like all these different kind of processes like that. But the other half of it was like the more character driven moments. And the intention with those was to make them more melodic. And there was this sort of conversation that was happening between me and David, like an abstract conversation, in the sense that he brought me in part because of the music I wrote for Fez. And so, and he temped a bunch of the score, the movie, with music from Fez. And so I was kind of competing with that in some level, and like trying to honor.
I would love to see the cut of that. Oh my God.
It was super weird the first time that I saw it. I was like, this is such a weird choice, because I just was so used to, hearing that music in the context I wrote it for. And It Follows is totally different. But, it was like the puzzle music when when they're driving, and it's like, the death cue, which is actually for the title of It Follows, which is the, if you listen to the death cue and you listen to the title It Follows, they're pretty similar. It's even more obvious if you check out Disasters for Piano.
Yep. I was just listening to that before you got on.
They sound like sibling tracks. So yeah. So it was a pretty weird, that was very strange experience. But there was a lot of great music in the temp score that I didn't know. And so it was really fun to be inspired by all that music. I mean, it was kind of my first exposure to like John Carpenter and Penderecki and people like that.
Dude, I can't imagine not knowing John Carpenter at this point. He's so awesome.
Yeah, I hadn't seen any of his movies, and then I saw The Thing a couple years ago, and that very quickly became one of my favorite movies. It's so good.
I think he's done his own soundtrack to everything, with the exception of The Mist, which I believe was Ennio Morricone.
Yeah,
which is also amazing. It's Ennio Morricone, but yeah, it's kind of strange because you had up to this point been working a little bit in film, animation, that kind of stuff. But did you was it a totally new experience to kind of work on a feature film at that point, or what adjustments did you have to make, and what did you learn from before that you carried to that?
Yeah, good point. I mean, there's definitely there are definitely connections to things I'd done before, because I'd done some short films. I had done a lot of cutscenes in games and that kind of thing. So I knew how to score to linear footage. Like, that was not unfamiliar to me, but the whole workflow is totally different, and the culture is different. The timelines are different. So the sense of how things go, the whole thing just feels very different. And then getting to go to the sound stage and while they mix the movie, that's all different. So in a way, it was like the perfect amount of challenge, that project. And part of it was just by necessity, because the initial intention was to have half a year to work on it. And then we only had a couple of weeks because we pushed to get into the Cannes Film Festival, which we did. But I had to write, so it means I had to write in the style that I could actually do that in, which was just pure synthesizers basically and effects. So I was basically working 12 to 15 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 or 4 weeks to get that finished. But it went pretty smoothly. There weren't too many hiccups in that process. So it was pretty cool.
There's another presentation that I saw you do where you spent some time talking about how you, especially in games, the music should be sort of dynamic and not just hearing the same things over and over again, in such a way that, and I can't really explain this the way that you can, but I guess you can do that if you want to, but making the experience sort of in the moment, it will never happen again. You'll never really hear exactly what you just heard or experience the same thing you just felt again. And with film, that's kind of totally out the window. And I think, if I remember correctly, you were already starting to think that way, or at least publicly saying that stuff around the same time. So with a film or TV show or whatever, it's just going to be the same thing every time you see it or hear it. But with your games, you've done a lot more intricate and beautiful designs, I think. Can you walk us through that idea a little bit before we get into
I think the way you phrase it is really interesting, because there's a distinction there, in the sense that you give somebody the same material that's pre-recorded or whatever, and they listen to it, it's the same thing every time. It kind of requires a different, I guess it sort of like triggers different synapses in your brain or something, because you're interpreting that every time, and you may interpret it differently, even though it's the same thing. Like reading a book, like a bunch of times, and every time you read it, it's different. With games, it's like, there's this opportunity to not only every time you play the game, it's different in your interpretation, but it's literally different every time you play. Like the actual material is different. So, that can be really powerful. It can also be like a major pitfall, like a logistical nightmare that you can kind of get yourself caught up in, because you're trying to be really clever and come up with cool ideas. And sometimes things are really cool in theory, but in practice, nobody can even tell the difference. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles. So those have been lessons that have been very hard earned for me over the years, because I've all the things that failed, like I learned a lot about like the things that work, don't work. It definitely elevated my chops as far as like, doing more technical things, doing technical sound design, implementation, coding, all that kind of stuff. Kind of got mega boosts just from trying to build all this wacky stuff. So it's a totally different vibe, because you're really getting into systems design and like all this like very heady shit that is not necessarily. I mean, you can do that on a film, but you don't really need to. You might be in either medium, you may be overcomplicating things, but there are opportunities in games to do things like that where it actually makes sense and it actually benefits the project. I mean, I think that way about the work that I've done for Dinosaur Polo Club. We made 2 games, Mini Metro, Mini Motorways, and the way those games they're puzzle games, basically. They're simulation games where they're kind of like a abstraction of, building a subway system or building a road system. And they just felt like very good candidates for a more procedural system, where you try to find the sweet spot where, it's different every time, but there's still like a character. There's still a sandbox that you're working within. And the sandbox isn't so big that it's basically just chaos noise. Like it's, that's sort of the challenge sometimes with these systems, is that the probabilities, like the possibility space of them, can be so enormous that it's hard to wrangle. And, there have been projects like that where, some systems that I built for things just ended up being just unwieldy, like just too hard to work on, because you had to account for all these edge cases and things. And so things can get really complicated really quickly, but you can do really interesting stuff that you can't do as easily, or you can actually do it in the actual playback, right? It can actually be different every time in playback. I mean, you can use these processes like in making music for films, but you still, at the end of the day, like, unless it's like, I don't know, what was that, like Bandersnatch, like Black Mirror episode or something, like for the most part, it's going to be printed one way, and that's just going to be that way. So
one of the other things that you kind of touched on, in that I believe it was the same video I was watching, but you were talking about how prior to the 20th century or late 19th century, there wasn't really any recording, like every time you heard music, it was live. And even if it was written music, like composed and played by a symphony, the symphony is not going to play it the same every time. And it could be a totally different symphony or band or guitar player or whatever. The air in the room could be different. And until we had recording, technology, no one had ever just heard the same thing twice like that. And now that's the number one way that people consume music. I mean, especially this past year, but what does that mean to you? Like as a shift in the way that people consume music?
That's a deep cut. I mean, I gave a very short talk about that, like, maybe 10 years ago.
It was a long time ago.
Permanence, versus impermanence kind of talk about how music used to be very impermanent and kind of like gets etched into your memory and it lives in your memory. Where now it's kind of I guess reinforced by the ability to just turn it on again and listen to the same recording. Um, yeah, I think in general, there's been like kind of a shift towards a more of like a collection culture, like people collecting uh, these types of things. But also it does seem like there's a human nature element to that. So I think it's just, obviously like reaching a new medium, reaching music has had kind of a profound effect on that. I do think that it's something that's overlooked. It's a really powerful thing that you can do. It's interesting actually, because I guess it's been coming up in like apps recently, like the last couple of years. People have started to do like, like Snapchat and all that kind of stuff. They started like messing with having impermanent recordings and that kind of stuff. It's definitely like psychologically a very different kind of experience when you know that something is a fleeting thing, and you're not gonna, it's not going to be captured and replayable or whatever. But yeah, it's definitely, things have flipped, because there was a time when, it was like 95% impermanence, and then, there were like wax cylinders or whatever, and, people doing really nerdy, weird stuff on paper that you could like, I don't know, run like those old ribbon recordings on greeting cards or something, whatever crazy technology, like phonograms or whatever weird technology they had back then. And that was really novel. And now it's the opposite. Now it's like, oh, pre-recorded music is like, that's just the way we ingest and, interface with music now, and, go into a show, or, well, especially last year or so. But, there's just been, a big shift. I don't know. Like, I haven't really thought about it a lot. I don't know what it means. I do think actually that there has been a little bit of a devaluing of music, because it's just so proliferated and like available to people. People kind of take it for granted, I think. I think that's true with all media, and people are kind of like burnt out and kind of overburdened with information. And, it's really important to, I think, prioritize your time and your energy, and you have like a limited capacity, I think, to take in information and to like put out, to like your inputs and outputs, like what you make or do, and, what you receive. So all that stuff, I think, has become increasingly prevalent and important, just because of, the technology and everything. And, I think music is a part of that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know all of world history, but at least in European and probably to some extent North American history, let's go back 1,000 years. Music was considered like holy. Like, this is not, you don't walk around every day. There's no radio. There's no, fucking iPod in your ear. There's none of this was going on. You didn't just hear music all the time, unless you were singing or humming or like making a beat. Or So when you walked into, like, I don't know, let's say a tavern in medieval times, and there was a singer there with a guitar or whatever, and they were playing music, and bards were kind of the history keepers too. They were singing songs about things that happened, and that's how they kept all that alive. And that's what kind of allowed them to keep it in their memories, because there's a pattern to it. I mean, it goes deep, and
it's really cool. They're like
really deeply in there.
Sort of like walking, they're like walking like a legendarium, like that, they had all the stories of the culture and stories from other places, and all of that got obfuscated by transmission or whatever, which is just the way it is, in all forms of storytelling, not just spoken word, but written word too. I mean, like I guess the religious texts of that time and everything getting like kind of transliterated in different ways over time. Definitely like played a very like played a different sort of role, and that sort of role has kind of been dramatically lessened, but that power, I think, still exists within music, and it's maybe to our disservice to not take advantage of that, to like embed it into what we do.
We'll never have that again. It's one of those things that I wish people, as you said, music has sort of been, all art has really been devalued in the past 30 years, just like specifically because of the internet and because of availability. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I want more people to be able to put their art out there if they can create it and make it kick ass.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't be here otherwise, or else you'd be, making some sort of strange music on a weird instrument, your slide guitar.
Yeah.
You had.
It's a mixed problem set. I mean, there's definitely positives and negatives that have come out of it.
Yeah. But then somebody's only experience with Disasterpeace with Rich Vreeland might have just been, I walked into the tavern and there was this crazy guy doing weird stuff, like, and it was beautiful, and like you had to be there.
I think that's why I try to keep a somewhat low profile. I think actually I like that. I like that element of that has largely gone away, because everything is about like turning yourself into like a personal, like, billboard that's always in people's faces all the time, and like everybody thinks that they know you, and that's just kind of the way things are now. And there's something really cool about like making your stuff and just letting it have a life of its own, and not always being the one out there like pawning it like personally like all the time, like finding other ways to like contribute basically that aren't so demystifying. Like I think there's a difference between that and like I think there's a way to do that without making people think of you in this sort of like unrealistic way of like being like I think people sometimes, if they don't they really like something, they don't know the person or whatever, they can kind of overemphasize it, or like put it on some kind of pedestal kind of thing. But I think there's a way to do both. Like, and that's kind of what I tried to do, is like be personable, but not be like, but not be front and center, and like, just try to make it about the work and not about me, basically. As much as I can.
I think you've done a good job, because I mean, obviously, like, I could just go say your name and name drop. I had Disasterpeace on the podcast and it was epic. And there's a very small subset of people who are going to respond to that. But to those few people who do, it's like, oh my God, like, really? That's so amazing. I'm such a huge fan. There's no like in between. There's no like discussion of like, I liked his early stuff, but like he really sold out after the It Follows.
Yeah, it's
soundtrack.
Either like, oh, that's awesome, or who's that? Yeah. There's no in between. That's true. Yeah, that has been my experience too.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Like I told a friend before we sat down here, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to interview that guy. And he's just like, the same friend I mentioned earlier, who I had played Fez. He showed me It Follows. We saw that movie in the theaters together. And then now we both know all of your shit, because we're like, oh, that's like it's almost like part of our friendship, not solely, but that's one of those joint experiences that we had that everyone
it's like a
else
mini
didn't
cult,
have
but
with us.
there's no leader.
Yeah. Yeah.
The leader went out to lunch permanently or something. That's really
you
cool.
Imagine like if a cult formed around you that you were never aware of. I mean, this probably happened to a lot of what we now call religious figures. Is Jesus has been dead for a long time, but there's a lot of people who are just kind of like acting on his behalf. I hope it doesn't get to that point with you, but unless you want it to.
I'm not worried about that. I don't think that would be a really weird cult. There's plenty of problems in the world and life that you could prioritize over, how to make a sweet tune or whatever.
Well, let's say that a meteor strikes the Earth and destroys everything, and the few people who survive are scouring for stuff, and the only thing they find from the history that happened before them is like a recording of something you did, and they would think, this is really important. Like, this is our only connection to our forefathers. And it could happen. You don't know. Like, it's happened so many times. Who knows if Beowulf was actually important?
Right.
It's just they found it. That's it.
Exists. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a good point. Yeah, I guess the context really matters. And it is really weird to think about that sort of thing specifically. You think about all the books that have been burned over the centuries and stuff, all the knowledge that's been lost. It's obvious that there was a certain like the knowledge level of humanity like got pretty sophisticated and high before everything kind of went to shit. With kind of the downfall of the empires and the burning of the library at Alexandria and all that kind of stuff.
Alexandria is a great example. I mean, Atlantis, who knows what they had there, if that even existed. There's a lot of that. Who knows what happened with the pyramids? It could have been aliens. It could have like.
Not saying it was aliens, but it is pretty weird.
And that's something that you guys kind of like I think that's what hooked me on Fez, was the playing with that without ever saying anything. And that's a really great trope of Hyperlight Drifter as well, this environmental storytelling, but it suggested all of these things like that in Fez, where like, here's some weird ruins that look like pyramids, and here's some alien looking shit, but we're not saying they're connected necessarily, and really played with people's brains like that. And
that's true. I never thought about that before, but yeah, there's definitely a connection there between those two games doing stuff like that. Kind of the esoterica, like the environmental storytelling, where there's like this kind of inexplicable stuff around. You're like, what is the story of this? That's a very human experience. Just what are these crazy ruins? There's some really wild stuff on the planet. Beyond the more common stuff, there's some really weird formations and giant man-made structures that are maybe like 1 foot off the ground, but they're like, a mile long or something. There's lots of weird stuff. And it's hard to know.
We kind of operate under the assumption that these big things were obviously, they required a lot of work and therefore must have been really important to a less sophisticated, technologically speaking, group of people. Right. So like Stonehenge could have just as easily been like, I don't know, let's throw some rocks together, man. It'll look pretty, like a little work of art thing. But then people have spent forever trying to figure out, what does it mean? And then, now we kind of get this idea that it was to measure the solstices, or, that kind of
sundial, right? Some kind of sundial.
Yeah. So but more than a sundial. The same thing kind of exists with the pyramids. Like they're cut in these ways that allow, like, and only at a certain time of year will it line up with this hole to shine light on this area. Yeah. And that seems like this super mystical thing, but what we do know is that the measurement of time was extremely important to people, and the ceremonies around that were,
right.
The summer solstice, the winter solstice, the autumnal equinox.
A lot of the Mesoamerican people had stuff like that too. Very specifically tailored towards tracking the stars and stuff like that.
Or it was aliens. One of the two. All right. So a couple of people wrote in, supporters of the show. So first of all, Uncle Had would like to, first of all, let you know that Hyperlight Drifter is his favorite soundtrack ever. But he wants to know, is there any song, and I would probably say a piece of work that you've done at any point that you feel doesn't really get the love that it deserves, or is something that's special to you that you feel like didn't really make it into the limelight, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the best work that I've done was for games that didn't really get much visibility or get played too much, or, maybe just weren't as popular or people didn't like as much. I wrote some music for a game called Crunch with a K that I'm really proud of. I think is really cool. It's kind of like, when I was starting, I did a lot of like very prog rock, like metal kind of inspired chiptune stuff. And then I didn't really do a whole lot of that for a couple of years. And then I did this project and I kind of got to like revisit that style. And that was really fun. There's a couple others. There's like, there's this really small game that came out shortly before I started working on Fez called Famaze. That is like an all FM soundtrack. I think it's the only FM soundtrack I've ever done, really, as far as like that being a concept or something. So it kind of has a certain sound that's like kind of like a high fidelity version of like a 90s sound card, like an OPL3 or something like that. And The Floor is Jelly is another one that I really like. I did all the music and all the sound effects for that game. That one just never really caught on, but I think it's a really good game too. It's really fun, interesting game. So those are a couple.
It's an interesting part of like the sort of collaborative process that you do. I mean, you're making soundtracks to things.
Mhm.
And so the likelihood of someone, hearing it and having that attachment to it very much depends on how successful the project as a whole is, not just how good your work was on it.
Yeah, I think when I realized that, definitely became a small contributor to the choices I would make as far as what to work on.
Yeah.
But I also realized how much value there was in it as far as trying to develop a career, to kind of try to work on things that were going to have a wide audience, because that meant that you were basically getting a ton of built-in marketing and stuff for your work for free. So without doing any marketing basically at all, I was very fortunate to basically get my music out to millions of people. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the coolest things about working on soundtracks. And it's definitely served me well over the years.
Yeah. I mean, you never know when you work on something small who those few subset of people are going to be who did hear it or did hear it, like play it. I mean, when you made Fez, you probably didn't expect that, later in your life, a movie director was going to approach you because they really liked that soundtrack and put you in.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't even have any plans to work on movies, so the whole thing was a surprise.
Yeah, opportunities at every door. I try to keep very similar philosophy with kind of how I do the show. Like, for every guest that's like a you or Cliff Blazitsky or something like that, there's always going to be a bunch of indie people that probably no one but me and those people have ever heard of. And I always think in the back of my mind, like, yeah, this isn't going to get the most clicks and downloads, and I don't really care that much about that. But I don't know where they're going to be in 10 years. Like I might have done a small favor for someone when they're working on their first project, and then they could come back and be like, hey, man, I'm making this big kick-ass awesome thing that's going to have a million people that care about it, and I want you to do the first interview. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't expect that, but like it could happen. And
that's why that is sort of like a benefit of just being kind of open and willing to talk to different people. Like you said, I don't think you want to bank on that, because it's probably not a great mindset to have, but just, right. It tends to work itself out if you show up, like, and if you're just honest and open, you talk to different people, and in the long run, it'll be good.
Agreed. We got another question from Mike Schmidt. He is a game developer, and he's working on a game called Star Explorers. He also created a software called Anomalies, and it's a procedural music generator, which he actually uses to score many of his games. And his question is, basically, have you ever experimented with procedural music, and what do you kind of think of it as a whole?
Oh, have I ever? Yeah, I mean, I have. I mean, I don't know if he's like, I don't know the definition that he's thinking of, but just like broadly speaking, I definitely have done a lot of procedural stuff with music. My only quote unquote game project that I've ever like done myself is this little project called January, which was something that I made to teach myself how to make a game. And it turned into this little music tool where you walk around and lick snowflakes, and it uses Markov chains to generate music. But I didn't know what Markov chains were at the time. I just, someone told me that one day, and I looked it up, and I was like, yeah, that is what it is. I just kind of, I don't know. I just thought, you lick a snowflake, it generates a note. Okay, cool. And then you look another one. Okay, what do you do now? Like, so I was like, okay, based on what the previous note was, we'll either pick this note or that note. And just based on that concept, kind of the whole thing came together. And over time, I kind of added all these other features to it. And, you can export what you make with a little character. You can export it into like a MIDI file. You could use it to make music. The work that I did for Mini Metro and Mini Motorways came out of that project directly, because they saw that and they were like, yeah, we're looking for somebody who we think like a procedural soundtrack would be good for this project. So they hit me up, and I was like, yes, this is like a dream project, and I agree. I think it would be cool. I've definitely done a lot of procedural type stuff just for fun on the side, experimenting with tools, some of which I probably release at some point. So it's something that I'm interested in. I try to avoid like getting too deep into the weeds with it. I just try to find like the sweet spot, where it's, where like I was saying before, where it's things don't get too unwieldy, because it can get very complicated very quickly.
Yeah. In his case, I think what he would do is kind of let it just go nuts and like play all sorts of different things. And then he would just listen to it and he would hear something like, whoa, that matters to my project. Like I could take that and expand upon it to make the soundtrack, not just a procedural song, stamp it into the game or whatever.
Yeah.
But
that's a great way to use it. Yeah. I mean, I think for creative inspiration, the tools are not always like a lot of the stuff that I've been making that does like generative music type stuff. Mm-hmm. You can dial in parameters and that sort of thing, but it's not always going to be super useful in context. Like, oh, I need to start a track or whatever. And I'm going to use this to like actually write. Like, it's not always super useful for that, but for creative inspiration, it can be really useful. And you can, obviously sample it and pull out ideas. And I think that's one of the coolest use cases for that kind of stuff.
So I know that you're like highly experimental in general with the ways that you approach music. And I can see I don't know what that is behind you, but this whiteboard with all sorts of different shit drawn all over it.
I have another one over here for something I'm working on right now. Yeah, I've been getting into software lately, but go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so you're getting into software, but like, what is I'm trying to get a glimpse into like how your mind approaches a project. So when you see, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Like, what's the first thing, and then how does it expand and end up on this whiteboard, and then how does that come to the finish?
So this whiteboard is like, it's basically all the stuff I'm working on, and it's like the last year or two I started using whiteboards because I just needed a better solution, I think, for something that I was staring at me every day and like kept me honest. And I wasn't getting like sidetracked, because I get sidetracked pretty easily, because I'm kind of like, I'm very fluid and kind of like get off track doing things that don't matter. So it's just to try to help me. So that's sort of like my bird's eye view of like the things that matter that I'm trying to do, like projects mostly, or like responsibilities that are ongoing, that are work. And yeah, I'll put stuff on there when I've decided that it's something I really want to do, and I'll take stuff off when it's done, or when I decide I'm not going to, I'm not going to hold space for it anymore. Even if it's like, it might even be something that's like, I'm still working on sometimes. It's all just like, it's all psychological. Like I still know I need to do it, but this is like, I just want to dedicate my working headspace to certain things and not others, even if they're things that I'm actually doing. And some of them are projects that have been ongoing for years, because they started as hobby projects when I was really busy doing commissions. And one of the things that I've been really focusing on lately is just prioritizing my self-directed work and deprioritizing commissions and like external projects. Because for me, at my stage of my career, I've been working for other people and realizing other people's creative visions for a really long time. And I've gotten it's been great, but it's not without certain pitfalls. And I've put off a lot of my own kind of ideas and work that I want to do for a long time. So I think, 15 years of doing things a certain way, it's not really working. It doesn't really work for me anymore. And I'm at a stage where I want to take back more, like a little more agency, and like kind of see where that takes me. So I have a lot of stuff that I'm kind of cooking right now, and it's been interesting so far. It's been a good learning experience, and it's been in a way, it's like throwing myself back into the ocean, because when you do soundtracks for a while, also like I've gotten pretty fortunate with a couple of projects. And so I was able to kind of just coast for a while off the success of certain things. And it's different. Obviously, I'm still really lucky and fortunate to have like kind of an audience and stuff. But branching out on my own is going to be very different than just kind of tying in with a movie or game project or whatever.
Yeah. So let's start transitioning towards like kind of the past few years up to now. What was the moment when you said, like, you looked at Hyperlight and you said, yeah, like, I'm doing that?
Yeah. My friend Roger, who we played music together. He was in the Disasterpeace band for a couple of years. He had a friend, this guy Alex, who is the creative director of Heart Machine, and I was his favorite musician, so he put us together, and he was making a game, and he hadn't really done any games before, but he had a really interesting background, and he had lot of really interesting people working for him, including Bo Blythe, who was someone who I really loved his work, a game developer. So, and I liked the art style. It felt like a good choice to dive into that as something that felt like a spiritual successor for me personally to Fez, that was sufficiently different enough that I could grow and do different things and not just, fall back on laurels and be kind of pigeonholed, or, whether that was an internal thing or externally. Like it felt like the right opportunity, the right thing to try to do. And, very early on, the things that I tried that were just bald reactions to the early footage of the game, Alex loved, and it felt really good. And that's kind of how that got going. And then it sort of, it evolved a lot over time. It was a pretty long project, and I wasn't always on. I was always, there were times when I was working on other things for months at a time, and I changed a lot during that period because I was in my mid-20s. So it got pretty hard to finish, but all things being said, it was it was a highly worthwhile experience.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what the kind of mysticism about that game is essentially, from what I can tell, it is a metaphor from Alex's perspective of the struggles he's had with his health. And I think a lot of people really latched onto that story. I mean, it's just a kick-ass game on its own without that. Yeah. But I think for a lot of the publicity that was going around, with was it PC Gamer, and they were really soaking that up. Like, this is such a beautiful way of this guy expressing himself. Yeah. And so it was more than just like a game project. Like, did you kind of feel a duty in any way? Like, this was so special. Like, this is such an important thing to this person that I want to bring my own game. Or
I think probably, yeah. I mean, I think getting to know him and seeing that kind of, show up in the project, I think that all contributed to my and just liking him generally as a person. I think and being excited about the people involved, and getting to go to LA because I lived in the Bay Area at the time, getting to go to LA and hang out. Like, all of it was cool. It was just a good, I tried to weigh everything, and all of that definitely played into it. I mean, I always want to do things that I feel like matter. And I think something so personal like that, like finding a way to take like a conventional genre, pay tribute to, the past, to very like popular touchstones like Zelda and stuff, but also to make it really personal, I think was like really cool. And that all helped me in, in my creative process for sure.
There's a fantastic video. I'll probably try to put this one in the notes, and people should check it out. But it's you and Akash Thacker doing this really cool panel where you're talking about all of the sound design and the different experimental processes that you went through to make this thing. And I mean, that was just really interesting. And you kind of got into how you did a completely different approach to making that soundtrack in particular. You know, you had like these weird kind of scaling factors that you were taking, like, okay, this is going to be a pattern that we use a lot. And then I'm probably doing a shit job of explaining it, but it was so interesting to just kind of get in the head of two guys like you that do what you did. And you guys were like friends, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
we were project.
We were buds in college, and then we didn't really talk much. And actually, it's only been in the last year, basically since the pandemic, that we've started like becoming good friends again, just like hanging out online and stuff. And I'm actually going to visit him soon, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think a lot of the experimentation on my side, I can't speak for Akash, but I know he did some really interesting stuff with wire recorders and stuff like that. But on my side,
his stethoscope microphone,
microphone. Yeah. On my side, like, I've always tried to integrate alternate kind of approaches into my work, and a lot of times it doesn't work out, but that's okay. I think just trying it, yields interesting results and just helps me with the process. I think that's why, even though, on many, many projects, when the first thing I do is sit down and I'll like sketch out stuff on the piano because it's low impact. It doesn't stress me out. I can just play and come up with ideas, and it's kind of like therapy. And, I almost never use the stuff that I come up with. Like I may like a lot of it. I like a lot, but it just doesn't have a place. It's just kind of a initial, like, even before I'm sitting down to do any production or anything, I'm just like, what are the emotions and stuff that I think can kind of work for this, the colors, what's going to work. And that as a process, it's not even about utility of the music. It's just the actual experience of, letting that out somehow. That's been very, very valuable. And it's to the point now where I have enough of those kind of sketches from different projects that I could almost make an album of just like, first impressions or something. It's just like of different, like, here's the first impression of It Follows. And it's like a totally alternate, like, theme song for It Follows. And there's like a totally alternate theme song for Hyperlight Drifter. Like I have a lot of these kind of things, and that's just, and I got really obsessed with the idea on Hyperlight Drifter of using music notation. Somehow I thought that would like help me make the music more symphonic or something. And that was like a total waste. Like it didn't work at all. But I did learn how much I hated music notation. So that was interesting. But it helped me figure out that the style of music that I was trying to write, which was like 6-minute pieces of music that were through composed and had a lot of different passages, like it wasn't going to work for the game because the music needed to be more reactive than that. And it's just another case of me trying to be clever and do something new and inventive or whatever. And it fails. And so I would just go back to something that is tried and true and works. And then find ways to tweak that support the game. And so that's what we did. Like it turned out that all it really needed was like pieces of music that are like 90 seconds long, that loop, and then just do like, 15 variations of that. And so that you can paint, basically you can paint the world and the context of different scenarios. And that, in a way, it became a really clear through line for me to Fez, because I did something similar in Fez. There's a lot of, adding stuff, pulling stuff out, no music, ambience, a lot of ambience work. That like ambience was a really big part of Fez, and it became a really big part of Hyperlight Drifter too.
I remember you at some point saying how I believe it was Thelonious Monk was talking about like the notes that you don't play are equally as important as the ones that you do. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that empty space is like what makes it so cool. It's like, if you're playing at full volume all the time and there's no point of silence or like rest, then you lose the effect of the big parts.
Yeah.
And I think you guys like knocked it out of the park as far as I'm concerned with that, especially with both of those soundtracks and just in general. But you could really just tell like how excited you guys were at the time talking about how much different experimentation you did and got to do with this thing. And that was actually like a tip that you did like a little thing where you're like, here's all these tips, for people. when you're hiring a sound designer or a musician or whatever. And one of them was, have patience with people doing weird, crazy things in order to achieve what you want.
Yeah. That initial stage, it's got to be that way. You got to go into the desert and find, bring back some weird fruit. But you only have so much time to do that, and that's, but you got to do it. So
yeah. For you, how important is that? Because do you do well with the timeline of like, okay, we're shipping this bad boy on this day, or do you kind of need a lot of room to wiggle around and play with things?
I have sort of a complicated relationship with that. I mean, I even wrote a foreword for a game audiobook called The Fruits of the Desert, which is basically about what you're talking about, kind of the initial period of like, doing weird stuff. My experience has been that when you're involved early, if you're involved before the project has a clear identity, you basically don't have a choice, or at least, to be fair, there's a personality component, perhaps. Like for me personally, if I feel that the project has not developed a clear identity yet, I'm not going to feel comfortable trying to make what I would call like shippable, or I don't know, like finalized structurally, like music. Like I can't even really like get the feel down right, because my process is so detail oriented to the way things feel. Like the way the game feels is so important to how I work. And so if the game feel is like kind of up in the air, then I don't know what to do. So, I'll probably do something else. That might be on the same project. Like that had kind of been the case on, Solar Ash, because that's a long-term project. In the beginning, I was just doing like a lot of experimentation with systems and sound design type stuff, because it was still too early. I felt like to really kind of, it's too early to lock down like a sound. And a game that has a really long development cycle may go through like multiple stages of identity and things changing and personnel changes and all that kind of stuff. So it's been my experience that I tend to do the best work at the very end. Like when the game is solid and it's like, oh, okay, I know what this game is. I can come in and I can like basically be the champion of this experience and, really, really like bring out all the things that need to be brought out. It's really hard for me to do that when, I'm trying to champion something that's not confident, like doesn't know what it is. So there's that sort of dichotomy, like, and it's a pet peeve of mine personally to like write a bunch of music in the beginning of a project that just kind of gets like tossed.
Yeah.
I mean, at the very least, like I'll keep all that. I'll contractually, I'll make sure that I can keep that and use it for something else or something. But I recently did a film where I wrote like 1/3 of the music I wrote is in the movie, and the other 2/3 are not. And so there'll be like, I don't know, 3 albums of music or something. Like in an ideal world, you don't have to do that. Sometimes, the fruit, you benefit from the fruits of those labors no matter what. I think if you can keep that, if you keep the work, but, I try to be efficient about it if I can. That's what I prefer.
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be the different types of people work in different ways, right? Like, so, Tolkien, right? He was going to take as long as he needed to make the story he wanted to make, period. And then there's, like a pulp writer who's, okay, what do you want? Okay. How long? All right. And then they'll come back, deadline, ship. And that's how they get that creative motivation through knowing that they have a set limit. And I mean, I was kind of like that when I was in school. I had a teacher that would tell me like, some people need to do 3 or 4 drafts or whatever to get things right. And for me, I'm very much that like in the moment, do it now kind of person. And they said like, you do your best work like the first time. And if you second guess yourself, oftentimes you get it wrong at that point, which is probably why podcasting is a good medium for me, because there's no going back.
Yeah. I mean, I think every medium is different, has different, there are different things that maybe work better than others in certain mediums. Like, I mean, the difference between writing a fantasy novel and writing a song is like, there's some concrete differences that would maybe, cause certain people to gravitate more towards the kind of Tolkien-esque like approach of writing something like a tome that's going to, just get refined over time versus, Linkin Park writing 100 songs for their first album. You know what I mean? Like it's a different beast, but I think also personality is a big part of it. And I think there are a million ways to do things. Not that long ago, I was listening to a podcast where they're interviewing Timothy Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, which is like a really, really interesting book about creativity. And he's just talking about like, you ask all these different people who make stuff, like how they go about things, and they all have totally different ways of doing it. People who are like hardcore procrastinators, people who, like you said, really were extremely precious with their work and it worked for them. And other people who were like the total opposite and like got up every day at the crack of dawn and like put on a suit and like wrote, like not like every day, like a, there's a famous songwriter whose name I can't remember who did that. So I don't think there's a wrong way to do it. It's really it's like a personal quest about figuring out like what is going to work the best for you and allow you to be the most effective.
I see this a lot with game designers. They all have equally diverse ways about going about finishing their projects. And some people are like, well, I've been working on this for 10 years and I don't see an end in sight. And that can be frustrating because like, it is art. First and foremost, they're in charge of their own art. But then people who
it'd be frustrating for other people who are working for them. I've been in that position before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, it's cool. Like we're here to talk about you, not my stupid thoughts. But to sum that up,
you're not stupid. I've really enjoyed this. But please continue.
Some people, like my friend Scumhead, who's a really, really super indie game designer, he just turns out games like left and right, and they're all kick ass. Like they're short, really cool experiences, and that's how he works. And he can't have other people inhibiting that process.
Yeah.
And then you have the other people who are, like I said, they do these 10-year long game projects that never ship, and then they never make any money, and then they can't keep doing what they love.
Right.
It's such a balance.
But there's also, I mean, this is also like looking at these things in a vacuum to a certain sense, because we don't necessarily know that the way that they're actually working is how they would be working if they were doing things in the an optimal way for themselves. Because, spending 10 years working on something and, going broke, that might not actually serve them. So it's kind of hard from the outside looking in. It's I think that's part of why it's a really personal thing. And, maybe someone like your friend, just, it's like a dispositional thing too. I mean, I know people like that, and I have a little bit of that in me too, where I just, I have friends who turn down, I mean, I think that, I've turned down some pretty amazing projects, but I know people who turn down pretty much everything, and they're not super well known, but they just like, I don't really care. Like, I just want to do what I want to do. And I admire that so much, that you just go for it. And obviously you need there's always complexity to these things and the decisions that people make and why they make them and why they can make them or can't make them. Obviously everyone is in a different situation. There might be like economic reasons. You might be, you might have a family to raise or whatever. There's like a million different factors that go into all this stuff, but, it's all super personal. Like, it's just not, I don't think there's a cut and dry way to look at it.
So at this point, I think we can say that you're a mainstay with Heart Machine. And last year we started to see the first blossoming roots of what will be Solar Ash Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much you can or want to say at this point, but like, it looks amazing. totally different kind of style in terms of, it's a 3D game instead of being a 2D Zelda-ish game. But what are you working on, and like, what are you looking forward to about people seeing that project?
It's a crazy project. It's been in development for a really long time. I've done a lot of work on it, and a lot of it in areas that I haven't necessarily done before. So it's been a really educational experience for me. I basically learned how to do 3D math type stuff, like do vector manipulation and stuff on this game. It was pretty much the first 3D environment game, like proper 3D environment game that I've worked on. And I spent a lot of time like coming up with systems, building systems, solving like really weird, interesting problems. So like as a learning experience, it's been huge. It's been so fascinating. Creatively, it's been a really challenging project. And had a lot of help. We have an audio team. Brought in a friend of mine, and actually kind of nominated him to take over the audio department because I think he's a better personality and culture fit than I am. I don't think I would make a good manager. That's just not really in my DNA so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am proud of the work that I've done on that project, and we have like I said, my friend and colleague Troop Gamage, who's been writing most of the music actually. I think it's turning out really, really well. And it's been a really interesting experience to kind of interface with something for such a long time and kind of figure out like how you fit, like what works, what works for you. Certainly I've written some music in the process to try to figure stuff out, but at this stage it's looking like I might not like have many contributions in that space for the game, and that's something that has been challenging at times for me, but I think I'm mostly okay with it at this point. It hasn't been for a lack of trying, it just hasn't really felt right, and every project is different, and I'm a very different person now than I was, when I worked on Hyperlight Drifter. And I'm still really proud of what we're doing. And I think it's a really interesting game, and hopefully it'll be out soon.
Yeah. I can't wait to see more, man. Before we get out of here, is there anything that you want to kind of plug, throw out there, or shout out to anyone in particular? Hey mom, I don't know.
Hi mom. She'll probably find this. Sometimes she finds my videos.
Yeah. Sorry for cursing.
Oh, she doesn't mind. Yeah. So I keep people who maybe aren't super familiar. Like I keep a pretty robust blog, and I don't really bother people unless I have something going on. So I have a mailing list that you can sign up for if you want to hear about what I'm doing. I've been building a bunch of music software, so that's kind of my headspace right now. I am doing a little bit of soundtrack stuff. I have a film soundtrack that'll be coming out at some point. I don't know if it's been announced yet. I probably should have looked into that before I came on here, but
we'll figure it out.
Yeah. So yeah. That's my deal. My website is disasterpeace.com, and follow me.
Cool, man.
Mailing list if you wanna know what's going on.
You're welcome back on the show literally anytime you want. Would love to kind of touch base as things go when you have new projects that come up. Solar Ash Kingdom and everything. We'll do
I'd
that.
love to come back. It's been a pleasure. It's been really interesting.
Song of the week is Serpents from the soundtrack to Crunch by Disasterpeace. And fucking A, man. This guy's amazing. Thank you so much to him for being a part of the show and giving me the chance to learn a bit from him, and also hearing me out about stupid ancient alien bullshit. That was super fun. And thank you to you for tuning in and listening. If this is your first episode of In the Keep, there's a lot more in the backlog. Definitely head over to our website, inthekeep.com. For those that are interested in supporting the show, it's just right there. The support tab is on the website. Got all sorts of different options and all that, but hang around. Just see how much you like it before you go diving down that rabbit hole. We'll also say thank you to all of our wonderful, wonderful supporters out there. So let's just give them a shout out right now. Paul, Moose, Dots, Zach, Alexander, Brad, Red Eyes, Anthony, Robert, Jack, Brandy, Fred, Lord Revan, Tones, Igrax, Simon, and Morpher, Mike, Zan, Bridge, Ben, Donkey, Shannon, and the whole Flam fam. All of these people are absolutely incredible, and I can't thank you enough for what you've done for supporting the show. So anyway, that's going to be it for this episode. I love you. The Drowned God Kathala loves you. Enjoy the rest of this song, and until next time, stay in the keep.